Where are you going to go? I'm sure that there will be more opportunities next summer. You can always check Hope's website. They always have all kinds of projects going on around the world. But we definitely are excited about the partnership with the churches in South America. Can you guys hear that bass? That's the children's ministry. If any of y'all want to go back there, I won't be offended. Actually, I'm probably not supposed to say that, like, liability and all. Yeah, we probably nix that. You can't do that. Okay, so, man, it's been amazing just to hear all different people share. So appreciate the Coopers and what they shared. Today we're doing our last installment, if you will, on a series on Ezra and Nehemiah. And then the next couple weeks, many of us are going to be in Orlando for this amazing worldwide conference. And then when we get back, we're excited about plans that we have for the fall and kind of kicking that off. So there's, as always, we're studying 2 books, right? Like 23 chapters, and it's really one book, right? We've talked about this. So there's tons that we could look at. There's tons that I want to share with you, and so I can't share all of it. And so we'll see. Today, just kind of, we're gonna close this out. I have one final topic. We've talked about the idea of rebuilding, right? And how the Israelites were in exile in Babylon, and Ezra and Nehemiah are about them coming back to rebuild. Rebuild the ruins, rebuild their lives, rebuild their relationship with God, rebuild their community. And so in the same way, we as a church have been in exile, in pandemic with COVID, and we were online, and we've been in this process of, okay, what does it look like to come out of this weird, strange time? And it gives us an opportunity to reset. And so we've used this as an opportunity to say, okay, what do we want to build? How do we want to build here? And so last week we talked a little bit about the approach that the communities of Ezra, that we read about in Ezra and Nehemiah, how they were trying to build on the legacy that they had been given, right? Their heritage, but then also think about who do we want to be. And so I put before you as a church that, hey, we really want everybody to be thinking and praying about what does it mean to be a part of this community? Are we going to roll up our sleeves and be a part of building in this community? And I shared that we're going to, when we come back from the conference, share about some of the ideas and vision that we have. We're going to put out this membership survey just to kind of get a feel for what everybody's thinking and who feels like, yes, this is what I want to do. And so the last topic that we're going to talk about today is just about what it means to be holy. Because one of the themes that you see throughout Ezra and Nehemiah is there's an emphasis and a focus on they want to be holy. They want to be God's people, and they're trying to figure out what does that mean? What does it mean to be holy? And so, like last week, we can start with a simple definition. What does it mean to be holy? Dedicated, you just, Google this, right? Dedicated or consecrated to God or a religious purpose, or to be sacred. And kind of from a biblical church perspective, a simple 2-word definition of what does it mean to be holy is set apart. Holy means that we are set apart for God. We are set apart to God, whether that's, a temple, whether that is a time, whether that is a person. And so we see this theme, if you read through Ezra and Nehemiah, you see this theme that comes up over and over again of, hey, we want to figure out how to be a holy people. And part of that is, Joe mentioned it, right? We are called as God's people to be set apart, to be dedicated, consecrated to God, to be sacred, to be different. We would need to be different from what's not holy. And this is a theme that we see all throughout Scripture, this idea of being separate and distinct as God's people. You think about Noah, he builds this ark. Nobody else is building arks, right? He's all of a sudden very distinct and separate to the point that people think he's crazy. You think about Abram. Hey, go to the land, leave your father's household and go to the land I will show you. And so Abraham's got to tell his wife, God told me that we need to move away. And sometimes we don't think about what that conversation was probably like. So again, all of a sudden, Abram is distinct and separate. You think about how throughout Genesis, God refers to himself And his people refer to him as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not the God of these lands or those lands. Back then, gods were tied to land. And so in Genesis, it's very different that God is not the God of a land. He's the God of people. He's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so those people have to decide, okay, are we going to be different? You think about Egypt and how they end up in Egypt and they're enslaved in Egypt, but then God says, these are my people, and I'm bringing my people out of Egypt, and they're different from the Egyptians. We think about as they come out of Egypt and they go into, preparing for the promised land, and they receive the 10 commandments. And really, the biggest point of the 10 commandments is, this is what it's going to look like for you to be separate and different. And then we see, one of the things about the 10 commandments is the Sabbath. And all the other peoples, they just work all the time. I want you to take a day to be separate, to be distinct and different. And then as you go into Canaan, I don't want you to mix with those peoples, because those peoples, they don't understand, and they are corrupt. They have been corrupted. And you need to be separate from those people because, again, I want you to be holy. And then, eventually, as we have read about, they go into exile. And after many, many years of struggling with what does this idea of being holy look like, God says, okay, you're not getting it. He sends them into exile. And in exile, all of a sudden, whereas when they were their own nation, everybody's like them. But then when they go to Babylon, nobody's like them. And all of a sudden, there's this community of people that's very different. The brothers and sisters that shared about going to other countries. If you ever traveled abroad, you get this idea. When I'm at home, people are generally like me. They speak the same language, have some of the same cultures, like Ty shared, eat some of the same foods. You go into a different culture, and all of a sudden you're like, wow, I feel separate and distinct. And so they were sent into exile, and all of a sudden they got this idea more, but then they're coming back in Ezra and Nehemiah from exile, and the question becomes, okay, what does it look like to be holy? What does it look like to be separate and distinct now? And so let's look at a few scriptures. In Ezra chapter 4, Zerubbabel, remember there's 3 different stages, and Zerubbabel has these outsiders that come, and they say, hey, we want to help. And, it might seem a little intense, but he says, you have no part with us in building a temple to our God. We alone will build it for the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, commanded us. In Ezra chapter 6, these same people are observing the Passover. And it says in verse 21, so the Israelites who had returned from the exile ate it together with all who had separated themselves from the unclean practices of their Gentile neighbors in order to seek the Lord, the God of Israel. What I'm wanting you to look for as you read these things is the way they're trying to figure out, okay, what does it look like for us to be separate as we come back and try to be God's holy people? In Ezra chapter 9, so this is the second phase, right? The first phase was Zerubbabel. The second phase was Ezra. In Ezra chapter 9, it says, after these things had been done, there's basically this teaching that goes on, right? After these things had been done, the leaders came to me and said, the people of Israel, including the priests and the Levites, have not kept themselves separate from the neighboring peoples with their detestable practices, like those of the Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Ammonites, Moabites, Egyptians, and Amorites. They have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and their sons, and have mingled the holy race with the peoples around them, and the leaders and officials have led the way in this unfaithfulness. And so we can see from Ezra's prayer that they're saying, oh man, as we're learning about the Bible, right, about the law, we're seeing that we have mixed with the surrounding peoples, and this is a problem. And Ezra explains, I've explained a little bit, but Ezra explains in his prayer here a little bit about why this was so concerning. So in verse 10, this is Ezra praying in response to this news that he's heard. And he says, but now, our God, what can we say after this? For we have forsaken the commands you gave to your servants the prophets when you said, the land you are entering to possess is a land polluted by the corruption of its peoples. By their detestable practices, they have filled it with their impurity from one end to the other. Therefore, do not give your daughters in marriage to their sons or take their daughters for your sons. Do not seek a treaty of friendship with them at any time, that you may be strong and eat the good things of the land and leave it to your children as an everlasting inheritance. And so Ezra is quoting, right, from the commands of God and saying, hey, God, you wanted us to be separate from these people, and this was your command, this was your instruction in verse 13. What has happened to us is a result of our evil deeds and our great guilt. And yet, our God, you have punished us less than our sins deserved and have given us a remnant like this. Shall we then break our commands again and intermarry with the peoples who commit such detestable practices? Would you not be angry enough with us to destroy us, leaving us no remnant or survivor? Lord, the God of Israel, you are righteous. We are left this day as a remnant. Here we are before you in our guilt, though because of it, not one of us can stand in your presence. So we see that the people are saying we need to be separate, and they're referring back to these practices from centuries and centuries and centuries before. And notice what Ezra keeps saying. He says, we're supposed to be separate from these people and their detestable practices. And so the focus is really on the detestable practices. The focus isn't so much on the people, but it's the people and the way that we can be corrupted by the detestable practices. If you're wondering, like the epitome of the detestable practices was child sacrifice, and that they would go sacrifice their kids. But, like archaeologically, as you look at the research, I mean, these were just pagan societies, and they had all kinds of crazy rituals, and God just said, hey, they're in a sense, they've made their decision, and they're beyond change at this moment. What you need to do is you need to go into this land and you need to focus on your relationship with me and not allow yourself to be influenced by those detestable practices. But there are some interesting ideas that we see settling into this context, into this passage. So notice all the people. We won't have to go back to it, but who do they say they're supposed to be separate from? And, the Canaanites and Perizzites and Hivites and Jebusites. If you have read through the Old Testament many times, you'll realize those are not the people that the community here is currently surrounded by. Those are the people that the first Jews going into Canaan were surrounded by. So they're taking a passage and saying, we're supposed to be separate from those people and applying it to their current situation. In other words, it's out of context. There were no Hivites or Jebusites left. And so they're saying, hey, 600, 700, 800 years ago, God told us to not intermarry with these people, and they're assuming it still applies that same day. But there's an assumption made there. Does that make sense? It's a different context. And so, yes, they're zealous to be holy, but their biblical sort of understanding isn't great. And the other thing that is interesting that they say in verse 2 is they have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and their sons and have mingled the holy race with the peoples around them. So this idea of mingling the holy race or mixing races, that's not in the Bible. In Leviticus 19:19, it does say they weren't supposed to mix seeds, like agriculturally. They weren't supposed to mix animals. But this idea of a holy race, they didn't get that from Scripture. They were called to be God's holy people because of their relationship with Him, but not because of their genes, not because of their race. And so already we see them, that they're zealous to be holy, but they're already getting a little bit mixed up here in the way that they're understanding Scripture. Marriage to foreigners is not forbidden in the Old Testament. It was a very specific situation when God said, go into Canaan and don't be corrupted by those people's detestable practices. But if you think about, there are many examples in Genesis of marriage to foreigners. Moses was married to Zipporah, a foreigner. We're going to talk more about that, in a minute. But so what happens is they're zealous, but we already see kind of some things a little bit off. And then in Ezra chapter 10, they make this covenant, and they say, hey, these things need to change, and they make radical steps to deal with the situation. In Nehemiah chapter 2, it says, to those who were opposing and mocking the people who were building the wall with Nehemiah or getting ready to build the wall with Nehemiah, Nehemiah says that he answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it. So again, you see Nehemiah come in to rebuild the wall, and again, this understanding we need to be separate. No, you can't help, you can't be a part of this. And then in Nehemiah chapter 9, so Nehemiah 6, they finished the wall. And Nehemiah chapter 9, on the 24th day of the same month, the Israelites gathered together, fasting and wearing sackcloth and putting dust on their heads. Those of Israelite descent had separated themselves from all foreigners. So again, this idea that they're separating themselves from all foreigners. And then you see this long prayer and this long list of all the people who are signing this covenant that we are going to actually be separate. And we're gonna recommit ourselves to being holy and being who God wants us to be. And then down at the end of this in Nehemiah chapter 10, after it lists all these people who have signed this covenant, it says the rest of the people, priests, Levites, gatekeepers, musicians, temple servants, and all who separated themselves from the neighboring peoples for the sake of the law of God, together with their wives and all their sons and daughters who were able to understand. All these now join their fellow Israelites, the nobles, and bind themselves with a curse and an oath to follow the law of God given through Moses, the servant of God, and to obey carefully all the commands, regulations, and decrees of the Lord our God. We promise not to give our daughters in marriage to the peoples around us, or to take their daughters for our sons. So again, we see this emphasis in this third stage of the rebuilding process on being separate and on not intermarrying. And then we get to the climax of really what is the Ezra-Nehemiah storyline. And in Nehemiah, so what they've done is they've built the wall. They've, in the first stage, they built the temple, the altar and the temple. In the second stage, Ezra came and did all this teaching and helped them understand who they needed to be as a community. The third stage, Nehemiah comes and rebuilds the wall. And so the climax, the high point here is they finish the wall and they dedicate the wall, and they have all these singers go around the walls, and they have this amazing celebration. And in Nehemiah 12:43, it says, on that day they offered great sacrifices, rejoicing because God had given them great joy. The women and children also rejoiced. The sound of rejoicing in Jerusalem could be heard far away. What a great day, right? What a great kind of picture that they've done it. They've come back and they've rebuilt, and they had this goal of being holy, and they've built the city, and there's songs and there's joy, and they're so excited, and the book ends there. I don't see a lot of Bibles open, but the book doesn't end there. So here's what I want to do. I want to take 5 minutes. I want you to grab the person next to you, a few people next to you, and I want you to read what happens next. So Nehemiah 12:44 through however far you get in 5 minutes. And again, don't do this by yourself, please. We want to do this in community. So grab a few people, grab 1 or 2 people with you. You have 5 minutes to read together. If you finish reading, you can pray together. And in 5 minutes, I'm going to call you back together, and we're going to see kind of how Nehemiah, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah end. Okay, so I think it's been about 5 minutes. I'd actually really love to just kind of hear what your thoughts are. Maybe we can talk about that some in the fellowship. From time to time, we've shown videos from the Bible Project. We normally don't show kind of the longer ones, but because we are studying Ezra and Nehemiah together, I've found this video very helpful, especially in the context of what we're looking at here with Nehemiah 13. So we're going to watch this video for a few minutes.
In most modern Bibles, these books are separate, but that division happened long after it was written. It was originally a unified work written by a single author. The story is set after the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and its temple and took many of the people into exile. And this book picks up about 50 years later and tells the return of some Israelites to Jerusalem and then what happened when they rebuilt the city and their lives there. Specifically, the book focuses on three key leaders who led the rebuilding efforts. You have Zerubbabel, then Ezra, and then Nehemiah. And the book's design focuses on the efforts of each leader. Zerubbabel leads a large group of people back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. Then about 60 years later, Ezra arrives in Jerusalem to teach the Torah and rebuild the community. And then he's followed by Nehemiah, who leads the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls. And these three stories are designed to be parallel. Each begins with the king of Persia, prompted by God to send the leader to Jerusalem, and he offers resources and support, and then each leader encounters opposition in their efforts, which they then overcome, but in a way that leads to a strange anticlimax in each of the three parts. Let's back up and see how it fits together. So the story begins with a decree from Cyrus, the king of Persia, and he's moved by God to allow the exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And the author says this fulfills a promise made by the prophet Jeremiah that the exiles would one day return to Jerusalem. Now, this fulfillment should trigger our hopes in the many other prophetic promises that exile was not the end of the story. We have hope for a future messianic king from the line of David. We have hope for a rebuilt temple where God's presence will dwell with his people. Hope for God's kingdom to come over all the nations and bring his blessing, just like he promised to Abraham. And so it's with all these hopes in mind that we read on into the story of Zerubbabel. His name means planted in Babylon. He represents the generation born in Babylonian captivity, and he leads a wave of Israelites returning to Jerusalem. After they settle there, they rebuild the altar for offering sacrifices, and later the temple itself. The foundation laying ceremony, and then the temple's final dedication, these are key moments. The past stories of the tabernacle and temple's dedication should be in our minds. This is when the fiery cloud of God's presence is supposed to descend. He's dwelling with his people, and it doesn't happen. And so while some people are happy about this new temple, the elders who had seen the previous temple of Solomon, they cry out in grief. It is nothing like their glorious past or their hopes for the future. And it's right here that we get the first story of opposition, and it's very odd. So the grandchildren of the Israelites who were not taken into exile, they had been living in Jerusalem all along, they come to offer help with the temple rebuilding. And Zerubbabel refuses. He says, "You have no part in our temple." And this, of course, generates a conflict, which Zerubbabel overcomes. But it's very strange, because the prophets had envisioned that the tribes of Israel would all come together, along with all of the nations, to participate in the worship of the God of Israel when the kingdom finally comes. So this is an anticlimactic moment, to say the least. In the next section, we zoom forward about 60 years, and we're introduced to Ezra. He's a leader among the exiled Israelites in Babylon. And he's a Torah scholar and a teacher. And so he gets appointed by Artaxerxes, king of Persia, to lead another wave of people back to Jerusalem. And Ezra wants to bring about spiritual and social renewal among the people. Our hopes are high. And again, we come to another anticlimactic moment in the story. Ezra learns that many of the exiled Israelites that had come back, they had married non-exiles who had been living around Jerusalem. Some of them were non-Israelites, and almost certainly some of them were. Ezra then appeals to the commands of the Torah, that Israel was supposed to be holy and separate from the ancient Canaanites. And he then says that the people living around Jerusalem are like the Canaanites. They're going to corrupt the exiles. So Ezra offers a prayer of repentance, and it's very heartfelt. But then he rallies all the leaders and enacts this divorce decree that says all these marriages should be annulled, the women and children sent away. And then the decree is only partially carried out. We're given a list of some of the men who divorced their wives. The story is very strange for a number of reasons. First of all, God never commanded Ezra to do any of this. It was the leaders of Jerusalem who led Ezra to make the decree. Second, the contemporary prophet Malachi, he did say that the exiles should care about purity, but he also said that God was opposed to divorce. And so the mixed results of the decree, this all fits into this pattern of a strange concluding anticlimax, which leads us to the next section about Nehemiah. He's an Israelite official serving in the Persian government, and when he hears about the ruined state of Jerusalem's walls, he prays and then gets permission from the Persian king Artaxerxes to go and rebuild the walls. The king even gives them an armed escort and all these resources. So after arriving in Jerusalem, he begins the building project, and he too faces opposition from the people who had already been living around Jerusalem. Once again, we face a tension in the story. The contemporary prophet Zechariah said that the new Jerusalem of God's kingdom would be a city without walls, that God's presence would surround it, that people from all nations would come and join the covenant people. But Nehemiah seems to operate with the opposite vision. He informs the people surrounding Jerusalem that they have no part in Jerusalem. And this, of course, provokes them to hostility. And so while Nehemiah carries out his vision for the city with integrity and courage, they have to build the city with armed guards to protect them, we keep wondering, could this whole conflict have been handled differently? And this all leads to the conclusion of the book in two movements, first positive and then negative. Ezra and Nehemiah combine forces to bring about a spiritual renewal among the people. They gather all the exiles together for a festival. They read and teach the Torah to all the people for 7 days. And then they celebrate the ancient Feast of Tabernacles to remember God's faithfulness from the Exodus and the wilderness journeys. Then they offer a confession of their sins. They vow themselves to renew the covenant, follow all the commands of the Torah. And they finish with a great celebration over the temple, the walls of Jerusalem. And we're thinking this could be the turning point, but it's not. The book ends on a huge downer. Nehemiah tours around the city, and he finds that the people have not been fulfilling their covenant vows. So Zerubbabel's work is undone as he finds the temple being neglected and staffed by all these unqualified people. He then discovers that Ezra's work is being compromised. He finds everyone violating the Torah, people are working on the Sabbath, and even his own work on the walls is involved because people are setting up markets around the walls of Jerusalem and working on the Sabbath. So Nehemiah, he goes on a rampage. He's beating people up, he's pulling out their hair, and he's yelling, "Obey the commands of the Torah." And his final words are a prayer that God would remember him, that at least he tried, and the book ends. I mean, it's very strange. But we've been prepared for it, right? These anticlimactic moments have been woven into the book's design intentionally. And so it raises the question, what on earth does this book contribute to the storyline of the Bible? Well, remember, the book started by raising our hopes in the prophetic promises about the Messiah, the temple, the kingdom of God, and then none of it happens. So even though Israel is now back in the land, their spiritual state seems unchanged from before the exile. And while Ezra and Nehemiah, they do their best, but their political and social reforms among the people don't address the core issues of their heart. So what the book is pointing out is the same need highlighted by the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel. What God's people need is a holistic transformation of their hearts if they're ever going to love and obey their God. And so the book ends on a downer, yes, but it forces you to keep reading on into the wisdom and prophetic books to find out what is God going to do to fulfill his great covenant promises. But for now, that's the book of Ezra and Nehemiah.
I feel like at the very least, at the end of the series, you have a better grasp of Ezra and Nehemiah. They do such a good job. BibleProject.com, all kinds of free resources and videos that are just great. So what we see is the heart is, let's be holy, But what happens over the course of this book, these two books together, is this kind of descent into legalism. Remember how when we were looking at the whole marriage issue, Ezra was emphasizing the detestable practices. You don't want to intermarry because of the detestable practices, and the focus, to some extent, was on the detestable practices. You with me there? So we just read in Nehemiah 13 and verse 1, where it says, "On that day the book of Moses was read aloud in the hearing of the people, and there it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever be admitted into the assembly of God, because they had not met the Israelites with food and water, but had hired Balaam to call a curse on them. Our God, however, turned the curse into a blessing. When the people heard this, they excluded from Israel all who were of foreign descent." Do you see the exaggeration there? Like you could see how if they said, okay, everybody who's of Moabite or Ammonite descent, but no, if you ain't one of us, get out of here. I mean, that's right. I mean, all of foreign descent, and then they're referencing something that happened probably 1,000 years before this. And actually, they're saying that no one of Ammonite or Moabite descent should ever be admitted, but that's not what Deuteronomy 23 says. Deuteronomy 23 says to the 10th generation. 1,000 years, I think, was long enough to get past the 10th generation. And so once again, their Bible is spotty, right? The other thing that's interesting is specifically the Moabite. Ruth was a Moabite. So David, a descendant of Ruth, by this logic, would not be able to be a part of Israel. And all the kings of Judah descended from David. Do you see how, just their zeal to be holy, it was still off base? There's probably a lot of different things that we could take away from this, but just the simple point is there's this progression into legalism, into ethnocentrism, and racism, in a sense. We're better than everybody else because God chose us, and so we see the precursor to the legalism and ethnocentrism that we see Jesus face, right? We see Jesus face this legalism that we see kind of beginning here in Ezra and Nehemiah. And so, again, the goal is to be holy, but this is always a challenge for us as human beings. Because what we realize is, okay, being holy means being separate. But what's the distinctive feature of God's people? And so, since Jesus, there have been lots of different approaches to what is different. And a lot of it centers around, well, I have the right beliefs. And so for 2,000 years, people have said, oh, okay, I'm holy and I'm separate because I have the right beliefs. And so you have disagreements and splits in the church. You have Christians forcing other people to become Christians, and things like the Inquisition and the Crusades. Even wars after the Reformation, even wars between Catholics and Protestants, and between Protestants and Protestants. They're trying to say, I have the right beliefs, so I'm going to make you believe because I'm holy. Do you see how it's so easy for it to get backward? And that's not, like the video, it's not at all the heart that we see in Scripture. You just think about other attempts, okay, we're going to be holy, and we see that the church is flawed or whatever, so you have these monastic movements where you have, monks going out into the desert and saying, okay, I'm just going to remove myself from everything. We're just going to be totally apart from the world. And that's how they tried to kind of characterize their separateness or their holiness. You have the Amish and the Mennonites who, in a very different way, they remove themselves and they're going to be separate and different. You have an emphasis on morals, right? We're separate because we're just better. We have better morals than other people. So you have like the Puritans, who, obviously, for those of us that grew up in this country, part of kind of our founding ideology was it was about morality and being more pure and more moral. You have fundamentalism, and that can be fundamentalism across, any branch of Christianity, but where it can become very focused on rules and become very legalistic and rigid. Back in the day, no music, no cards, dancing, Halloween is bad, and all these, that's what makes us different, is all these external things. Or, groups that spring up and they say, we have lost or hidden or newly revealed things from God, and so the Mormons or the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Seventh-day Adventists or other Seventh-day movements where they say, we are different because our beliefs are different, or because we have this thing we observe that's different, or we think about the history of this fellowship and of our family of churches, and the idea of we're different because we're more, serious about discipleship, and we're more serious about evangelism and about growth, and we're going to organize ourselves in such a way to make that happen, and so that's what makes us different. So for 2,000 years, this is the challenge for us, is we are called to be holy. In Hebrews 12 and verse 14, it says, without holiness, no one will see the Lord. So we got to be holy. We need to be separate, but we end up getting fixated on like these external things. And so I wanted to kind of talk first about sort of the quote-unquote negative from Ezra and Nehemiah, right? How they kind of got off track the same way we get off track. But I want to close with, hey, what can we take away? We can be inspired by their passion to please God, their passion to build for God, their willingness to say, hey, I may not have it all figured out, but I'm going to do something. I'm going to build. I'm not going to just tear down and point the finger, but I'm going to get busy with the act of building for God. And that's something we can respect. But I do think we have to think, okay, let's imitate that heart, but let's make sure we major in the majors, if you will. That we focus on the most important things. What are the heart issues for us? Well, is there a heart that we want to be holy and separate? Do we want to honor God with our devotion, with our time, with our money, with our trust, with our obedience? I mean, these are all more abstract concepts, but is that our desire? Is that our intention? Is that what we're thinking about? And then what are the idols, right, that pull us away? What are the detestable practices, that cause us to become idolatrous? Adriana's going to come up, and she's going to share a little bit about what these things look like, what it looks like for us to have the right heart and to major in the majors.
Good morning, everybody. I know we've been talking about a lot, and everybody's probably real full. I'm really full as well, but I just wanted to share a little bit about what I've been thinking about the last week as I've been reading Ezra and Nehemiah and thinking about these things. I've been chewing a little bit on two books that I wanted to share, Gospel Allegiance and Gods at War. And just, this time that we're talking about coming out of COVID and recommitting ourselves to the church, starting to rebuild here again, and I picked up Gospel Allegiance. It just made me think of just growing up here in the States and going to school every day, like pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands. You guys know it? I mean, I said it every day from, 5 years old to 18 years old. I pledged allegiance to our flag. And now, this book is helping me realize, okay, just like how you did that, like every day you have to pledge allegiance to Jesus and his kingdom. And, the culture that we live in now, we don't have, you guys have probably heard some of the gods that they were worshiping that had the detestable practices. We don't have the worshiping Asherah, Moloch. They set up golden calves. Those are not our struggles right now in 2022. I don't think you're going to go sacrifice your child to Moloch in the fire. I don't think you're going to do that. But we have different things now in our culture that pull at us and detestable practices all around. So if you want to learn about that, this is a great book, Gods at War, and I'll just read a couple from the table of contents. Some of the gods that we're, pulled to following is the gods of pleasure. We can idolize food, we can idolize sex, we can idolize entertainment, like just pleasure. power. We can idolize power by wanting success, wanting money, achievement. We can idolize love, even though love is an incredible thing. We can idolize relationships, romance, even family, even ourselves, you know? We can love ourselves more than we love Jesus. So I just wanted to read a little bit about that and just have you guys think, like, of your allegiance. Like, is your allegiance really to Jesus as Lord and to his kingdom, to each other? This is the little piece of kingdom that we have. Is your allegiance to Jesus and is your allegiance to one another? That's what we're trying to rebuild. And we have been rusty with COVID. We're trying to come out of it and rebuild, give our hearts to Jesus. I think for me personally, the entertainment one kind of hit home for me when I looked at this, because we were home more. We were on our phones more. We were watching more TV. You know, there was more, TikTok and shows on Netflix. There are more shows out there than anyone can ever watch. Like, there's so many options now. And I think about great movie, Gladiator, blanking on his name. But when he's like frustrated in the arena and he says, "Are you not entertained?" Like, he's frustrated because those people are getting their entertainment from blood and gore and murder. And I think sometimes God might be a little frustrated with us and with me, Adriana Brown, how much I need to be entertained and how much I want my comfort and I want to, just relax and watch this show and that show and then do this and go to this movie and hear this music. And there's so many options. It gives me anxiety to pick a show. I'm not kidding you. When we sit down to pick a movie, it gives me anxiety. But just think about yourself and think about your allegiance, and just encourage you to think about pledging your allegiance to Jesus and his kingdom.
So the simple thing is Jesus, right? It can be really confusing and overwhelming to think about, okay, what am I supposed to do to be holy, and what's supposed to make me separate, but just looking at Jesus and having our eyes on Jesus. And so we've tried to talk here in the church about 3 very simple commands that Jesus gave, and that's what we want to build our community here around. And we feel like if we can really focus on Jesus and his words and his heart, we're probably in the right ballpark. Because he came into this culture of legalism and of people trying to be holy and separate by all these external things. And he tried to, help them correct course. And so I know we've talked about these things over and over and over again, but spaced repetition, right, helps things to sink in. So what are the 3 things? If we can look at these next few slides here. So what's Jesus' way? The greatest commandment, right, to love God with everything. The new commandment, to love each other the way he loved us. And then the Great Commission, let's go share it with other people. I mean, simple concepts. These are Jesus' words. So is our heart in line with this? Now again, not the actions, right? Because sometimes we can just do the actions and tick off actions that we associate with these things, but we've got to keep going back to where is my heart? But what does it look like to do these things? If we can look at the next slide. Do I really love God? If I don't spend any time with God, if I'm not pursuing God, then how can I say I love God? And so do I really have a relationship with God? Do I really love my brothers and my sisters in the church? And again, the new commandment is addressed to followers of Jesus. It's not about a generic love for mankind. It's about a very specific Jesus-like love for our brothers and our sisters in our community of faith. And so am I loving my brothers and my sisters the way Jesus calls me to? And then is there a love for the lost? Is there a love for people that are hurting? When I see a need, does my heart go out? Whether that's meeting needs physically, whether that's needs spiritually, but is there a love for the lost? And so the last slide here just kind of breaks it down a little bit in terms of how do we try to just put this into practice. Again, time with God. We as a community do not believe that people are going to grow closer to God if we don't spend time with God. Now, again, we don't want to be rigid about this, and it's not about checking boxes every day, but the bottom line is, if you want to be close to people, you got to spend time with them. If you want to be close to God, you got to spend time with God. And then this idea of small groups, what we see in Scripture is that we can build better, intimate friendships and relationships through small groups. And being a part of a small community, like Jesus created this community with himself and the 12, right? He didn't pick 120, he picked 12. And so the idea of small groups, but then these relationships within those small groups, or just within the church in general, where I appreciate what Becky shared, just that everywhere she's gone, the 4 churches she's been a part of, she's made a best friend. And she made a joke about how easy that was, and I want to be sure you didn't miss that was a joke, because Becky's the kind of person that's really she's gonna go after it and put in the work required to build friendships. But it takes work. It takes intentionality to build friendships, and then none of us share the gospel on accident. This idea that people are going to see my shining example and they're going to come ask me how to be like Jesus, that's not how Jesus did it. Jesus walked up to people and said, "You follow me." And so if we're going to do it the Jesus way, it's not passive, it's something that we do proactively. And so again, I know we've talked about these things, but we want to keep coming back to the heart of these basics. The idea of the Sabbath that we read about here in Ezra and Nehemiah, like, don't just think about the rigid kind of legalistic, the things that Jesus was saying, hey, you guys are too fixated on the Sabbath, but think about the purity of it, right? Think about what God is trying to teach his people. God gave them the Sabbath as they are coming out of being slaves in Egypt, and their value was tied to whether they were going to produce. They had to produce for the Egyptians. And so God says, okay, I want you to take a whole day and do nothing, because I want you to understand that your value is not attached to your production. I give you your value. Your value is because I have chosen you. The Sabbath was a rejection of the world's approach to their lives. Again, approach to productivity, approach to their schedules, approach to the busyness, right, that life just so easily sucks us into. And God said, okay, I don't want you to do that. I don't want you to live like everybody else. And this required trust. And it set their schedule apart, making it clear to everybody around them, making it clear to every generation that they were different. And so we don't want to be focused on this external as what makes us different, but that external thing, it was something, it was a tool that God used to help the people have an identity in the face of other cultures and other peoples, but also in terms of teaching their kids. Hey, Mom, Dad, why do we do nothing on Saturday and everybody else is doing stuff? It's a great opportunity for me to explain why we do this. So if it's done with the right heart, what an incredible thing. So does that mean we're going to start, instituting the Sabbath here in the church? No. We've talked about the idea of rest and trying to learn these lessons. The point we're trying to make is, if we're going to be separate and holy, what does that look like? How am I going about being separate from the world around me? How does my approach to my time and to my schedule make it clear that my priorities are different? Every time that we have the opportunity to come together is an opportunity to put this into practice. It's putting these, time with God. We do that communally. We need to do that individually, but we also do it communally. We work on our relationships when we come together, whether in small groups or here as a church. We can invite people and we can share the gospel. Every time we come together is an opportunity to put this into practice. It's also an opportunity for us to share with our families and the world around us that my priorities are different. And so whether that's, am I going to keep working, or am I going to set aside time to put God first and be with the community? Am I going to study and put school first, or am I going to set aside time to put God first and to be connected to the community? Am I going to spend time with my family, or is this an opportunity for my family to understand where my priorities and values lie? And every time we handle these questions in a way that honors God and demonstrates our priorities, it's an opportunity to model that for others. And every time we miss that opportunity, what we're saying is we're just a little bit more like everybody else around us. Again, I'm not trying to say, legalistically that, a Christian is supposed to be focused on attendance, but I'm trying to help us understand a concept of what it means to be holy. And it does. It takes sacrifice to build these relationships. I really appreciated last week, Edric and Priscilla Perellian shared, and they shared about, I don't know if they're here today, they might be back with the kids, but they shared about this big bump that they had in their marriage. And then they shared about the friends that they were able to call to get help. They didn't make those friends last week when they needed the help. They had been working on that friendship for years so that when they needed the friendship, it was there. That's how it works. And so every time we say, you know what, my values are, I prioritize time with the community, every time you do that, you're investing, you're getting a little bit closer. And every time you say, I can't make it this time. No, not going to be there this time. It's one more missed opportunity to build these relationships, to build that community. And I just think these are things we got to think about. And COVID has put us behind. That's the reality, right? COVID made it harder. COVID got us out of habits and out of practice, and COVID separated us. So as we come out of exile, we got to realize, okay, if I'm going to be holy and set apart, I've got to be very intentional about this. Adriana shared this little towel that she got a while back I think I have a slide for, where the idea that, we've all heard it takes a village to raise a child, right? So I keep hearing it takes a village to raise a child. Do they just show up? Is there like a number to call? And so this is true with our kids, but it's just also true with relationships. Oh, I know relationships are really important, so when's God going to send me somebody? Oh, you know what? Man, my kids, when they're teens, they're going to need some really great friendships. So, I'll cross that bridge when I get there. And again, especially, when we talk about our kids, for 2 years with COVID, we might have been getting on Zoom. Most of our kids weren't. And so every time we don't come together, we rob them of an opportunity to be a part of a village. We rob ourselves of that opportunity. We rob them of that opportunity. And what happens is, when you need them, when you need the village, if you don't live in the village isn't there. Does that make sense? But again, I think sometimes COVID can kind of lull us to sleep with this. The village can easily become work. It can become school. It can become the neighborhood. And again, thinking about our kids, they're going to have a village. They're going to school. They're in a homeschool group. They're playing sports. They're playing video games. They're online. They're on social media. They're going to have a village. We are all going to have a village. And if we're not intentional about making sure that village is a village of people who are trying to be God's people, then your village is going to be where you live. Your village is going to be where you decided to move in. It's going to be where you decided to invest and put your time. So when we make it our goal to be holy, when we really focus on the heart of what Jesus is teaching us, what he wants us to have, we can envision this community that is where we want to be, that it's full of joy and friendships and relationships and something we're proud of and excited about. And we can see where Nehemiah should have ended in chapter 12 and verse 43.